and it gets very cold. People don't realize that actually you're 5,000 or 6,000 feet up, and even in the rainy season when it's still pouring down massively, it's quite cold. In fact, it can drop to below zero at night, and during the days it can be very chilly as well. We have got a very big subject to discuss today, which is essentially Mutaguchi's march on Delhi, the invasion of India in 1944, the essence of which were the great battles of Imphal and Kohima. So I'll try and take you through those in a relatively straightforward fashion, with my eye on the time, because we're going to have a lot to cover. So the first thing we need to discuss is the rationale for what was Operation Yugo, or Operation C, which is the invasion of India. And I think there were three major reasons for it. The first was the realization by the Japanese in 1943 that the British in Manipur, which is the princely state sitting next to Burma, were increasing their military stores and equipment and resources, and were threatening to launch maybe a limited offensive into Burma. So the Japanese were concerned about this. The second, which we'll discuss tomorrow night, was that in February 1943, Ord Wingate, the gentleman on the left of your screen there, launched an offensive into Upper Burma by crossing the Chindwin and roaming around the area above the Irrawaddy. In fact, at one stage, the Shweli Bend, he crossed the Irrawaddy. A bit of a problem, but it demonstrated to Mutaguchi, that who is now the commander of the 15th Army, the Japanese 15th Army in northern Burma, or Upper Burma, that the mountains to the west of the Chindwin were crossable. And it's very interesting that in 1942 and the start of 1943, the Japanese had initially considered invading India into Manipur and Assam, but considered that the mountains there were too severe for their troops. And after a while, Mutaguchi at the time, as the commander of the 18th Division at the time, the Japanese decided not to carry out what was then Operation Z, the invasion of India. A year later, the situation had changed, and as I said, one of the reasons for that change was the work of the Chindits, proving that the hills could be crossed. And the third reason really was the work of the man on the right of the screen, Subhas Chandra Bose, who is a really quite extreme Indian nationalist. We don't have time to go into Indian nationalism tonight. It's an absolutely incredible subject. Lots of my friends in India are much better versed in it than I. But suffice it to say, for the purpose of the conversation, you need to know that nationalism was really a very diverse beast, and there were extremes of opinion in nationalism. Many nationalists joined the Indian Army, for instance, because they believed in government, but they just believed the government needed to be Indian rather than British. This gentleman here, was part of a very extreme strand of Bengali nationalism, which wanted to use force, any force, fascist force if necessary, to assert its prerogatives. Okay, so by the end of 1943, start of 1944, the Japanese had decided that they would indeed invade India. It would be a limited operation into Manipur, the capital of which is Imphal. And let's just spend a little moment on this. Rory sent an email through last night saying it's quite difficult really to understand the geography. And Rory, you're absolutely right. It's unless you see it, it's quite difficult to understand. But let's just spend a moment thinking about this now. Effectively, from the Chindwin, which is in Burma on the right-hand side of the map that you can see there, all the way across the Brahmaputra, which is probably about 150 miles, lie a series of ranges of serrated, angry, jungle-covered hills that reach up between 5,500 and 6,000 feet. And these hills are often just called the Naga Hills. The hills to the right-hand side bordering the Chindwin don't actually have a name. The Japanese actually called them erroneously the Arakan Hills. They weren't, of course, but they needed a name and they didn't have one. And as you go up, you cross the Chindwin and you start climbing these hills. The hill on the right is the top of the Shenam Saddle, taken couple of years ago when I was there with James Holland. And as you cross these hills, you then drop down into the Imphal Plain. The Imphal Plain is an ancient alluvial lake, and it's surrounded on all sides by mountains. And just to orientate yourselves, I've gone and forgotten to get the little red dot. So let me get a red dot for you here. And to orientate yourselves, let's just go across the Chindwin, and we're going to, I can't actually see my screen, which isn't very helpful. Yes, here we are. We're going to cross the Chindwin here. We're going to go up to Tamu, which is here. Moray is a small town just to the north of Tamu, which is where the 20th Indian Division was. And we're going to climb straight into the hills over the Shenam Saddle here. Then we drop down. As we drop down into the Imphal Plain at Palal, it's all very flat. This is the flat bit here. This is all very flat. And in the middle of the monsoon, Loktak Lake, which is this thing here, expands out and covers much of the basin of the plain. Imphal town is here. And then what we have is a road which runs all the way. So I'm just trying to move my screen, but it runs all the way through up past Kangmatongbi, up here, Malsang Song, into Kohima up here, and then over and down the other side of the Naga Hills into the Brahmaputra Valley. So basically everything from here on the left and here on the right, the stuff on the left is the Brahmaputra Valley, the stuff on the right is the Chindwin, is Manipur and Assam, and it's all jungle covered hills. So it's about 150 miles from the Chindwin across the Brahmaputra. So that's really where we are to orientate ourselves to the map. Let's just move on and say a few things, a few words about the people who inhabited these hills then and now. At the time, maybe about 200,000 people lived in the hills, and they most of them are Nagas. There are 16 separate Naga tribes with separate languages. These aren't separate dialects, but separate languages. Running alongside the Chindwin, there's another tribe of people who are ethnically different to the Nagas, called the Kukis. The Nagas occupy the land to the north and also to the south. But as I said, the tribes are all very different. Quite remarkable people, very significant history of headhunting. The British Empire sort of lapped up into the edges of the Naga Hills in the 1880s or late 1870s in order to be able to provide security to villages in the Brahmaputra and to tea plantations from the depredations of these Nagas who would come down and raid. A very significant feature of the fighting at Kohima in particular in 1944 was the support of the Naga people for the British and Allied forces defending Kohima and fighting through the hills. And we don't have a huge amount of time, but it is quite a remarkable story, in fact. And I'm just going to quickly pause there and say that I've long been a trustee of the Kohima Educational Trust, and I really recommend it to you tonight. You can Google them and find out about the work of the trust. Last year, the trust published this book by Charles Chasey and Harry Fessett, The Road to Kohima, which is one of the first books ever to detail the Naga story of the battle. And it would be absolutely fabulous if you could go out and order this online. You can get it from the Kohima Educational Trust website. And this is really quite amazing, because if you think about military history or the history of war, very rarely is the history of those people who are caught up, the civilians, the innocents caught up in the battle, ever recorded. And the KET is doing something, some small bit to change that. I do recommend that to you. Let's say a few words about the competing commanders. You've heard a little bit about Slim on the first couple of, well, that's the second day in fact, and a little bit yesterday. And you've heard a little bit about Mutiguchi. Of course, Slim's the chap on the left and Mutiguchi's the chap on the right. So we're talking about 1944. So the offensive begins in March, early March 1944. Slim had been given command of the Eastern Army the previous October. In November, it had become the 14th Army, a change of name, but it was in essence an opportunity to reshape the purpose of the army for his own ends, which is the defense of India and hopefully an offensive into Burma in due course. We don't have a lot of time tonight to talk about Slim, but as I said on the second night, he was the only corps commander, the only man who had commanded a formation in battle against the Japanese and knew exactly what he was facing. Irwin, as we discovered last night, didn't know what he was facing and repeated lots of silly mistakes that could have been ironed out had he actually talked to Slim or listened to him or recognized that he didn't have all the answers. Slim had also had the advantage of not fighting in Arakan and having the opportunity of training the remainder of the Eastern Army for war, and he did it relentlessly through 1943 and early 1944. And the transformation, as I mentioned a couple of days ago, in the fortunes of the 14th Army and the men fighting in India and then in Burma and what was to become the 14th Army was really hinged around the transformation that took place in 1943. And again, we don't have a huge amount of time to talk about it, but in history, military history in particular, it's often not much effort is placed on it. But in order to be able to understand the dramatic difference in combat effectiveness, the effectiveness of the army in 1944 and that in 1945, from that which was displayed in 1942, you need to understand how the army retrained, how it rebuilt its morale, what it did with its equipment, etc. And Slim was the man who masterminded it all. I need also very quickly to say that he was supported by the new Commander-in-Chief India at the time, Claude Auchinleck, who was a long-serving Indian Army officer. His second time as Commander-in-Chief, he was absolutely magnificent. The three men, sorry ladies, there weren't any ladies involved at this stage, and maybe in future war I'll be talking about something slightly different, but in 1944, the three men who defended India successfully and who conquered Burma in 1945 were Slim, Auchinleck, and Mountbatten. Those three. Okay, now Motiguchi, very quickly. Motiguchi was actually a very, very competent commander. He had lots of faults, but he was a competent commander. He was actually a better strategist, because one of the great unknown factors about Operation C was that the only Japanese commander who got the strategy right was Motiguchi. Now, Motiguchi completely messed up the execution, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but he got the strategy right. I'm going to just spend a little moment talking about that. What was that strategy? Well, let's go to the next slide. So the strategy was to advance on four fronts into Manipur and Assam, and surround the British Army as it was deployed in Assam, in Manipur rather, cut the road from Imphal across the mountains through Kohima, a little Naga village, which you can see on the screen here. And that would enable, or that would stop the British from sending reinforcements across the hills into Imphal. And that was the tactical bit of the plan. The strategic bit of the plan was that Motiguchi looked at Manipur and Assam and said, actually, the strategic objective of this whole offensive has got to be something more than simply defeating the army at Imphal, because in due course, 6-8 months, something like that, the British will be able to replace what they've lost. We're going to have trouble defending it, keeping ourselves sustained in Imphal. We're going to need to have resources and food and equipment all around. Where are we going to get that from? What we really need to do is we need to destabilize the entire British military effort in eastern India. And he looked at the map very closely and he said, well, actually, the strategic objective par excellence in eastern India is Dimapur. Dimapur in the Brahmaputra Valley was the nodal point of the line of communication reaching all the way back to Calcutta. It's in the Brahmaputra Valley. It's where all the administration and the depots and all the logistical resources to support the entire army across the mountains was based. It was also the point at which the railway, the Bengal and Assam railway, came through and went up north along the Brahmaputra to Lido, which of course was the focal point for the hump airlift into China. And Motiguchi said to himself, okay, And he tried to persuade General Kuwabe, we'll come to Kuwabe in a moment, very briefly, he tried to persuade General Kuwabe that actually he should allow Sato, General Sato's troops of the 31st Division aiming at Kohima to carry on and go down to Dimapur. Kuwabe refused. Kuwabe was not a man of strategic intelligence. He didn't understand things in the same way that Mutiguchi did. And this was a really seriously missed opportunity. It's something that I've become increasingly certain of as the years have gone by. And the book that I'm writing at the moment, I've come down definitively on this is the point at which the Japanese lost the war. For the simple reason that if the Japanese, even with the battalion, had fallen on Dimapur, Dimapur was in complete chaos at the time. India may not have fallen. In fact, it's very unlikely that India would have fallen. But there would have been no way for the Allies, the British or the Americans, to resupply China or to resupply the Eastern Front against Burma. And there would have been no reconquest of Burma in 1945. The Japanese would have to have been defeated elsewhere. And as many of you will know, one of the significant features of the war in the Far East and the Pacific is that every part of the Japanese empire had to be defeated. Imagine what it would have been like to have reached August 1945 for a significant army like the Burma Area Army, the 15th Army in Burma, 115,000 men strong, very powerful army, 2 tank regiments. You know, it was one of the biggest armies the Japanese had if it hadn't been defeated. There are lots and lots of reasons why it was important that all components of the Burma Area Army were defeated to enable there to have been a complete defeat of the Japanese in 1945. If the Japanese had managed to get to Dimapur, we would have seen something very different. Right, I'm going to move on. So just to remind everyone, looking at the map, the plan was that the 33rd Division under General Yanagida would come up across the hills, across the Manipur River, which is here, attack the 17th Indian Division at Tiddim, defeat them, move up through the Tiddim Road to the base of Imphal at Bishampur, which is here. And part of that attack, they would cut the road as they usually did at Tongzan and come over the Mombi track here. And they did that very successfully. The second attack would be the Japanese would pretend it to be the main attack, which is General Yamauchi's attack, across the Mombi track and then up through the road from Tamu over the Shenam Saddle into the Imphal plain itself. The third attack was by the 31st Division. I can't actually see it here because something else is cutting my screen, but hopefully you will be able to see it. So hopefully the red dot's in the right place, cutting across the hills to Kohima. And that was with a whole division, the 31st Division under General Sato. Now, it's quite extraordinary that a whole division was being sent to Kohima. And it is really strange. If Sato's job was simply to attack Kohima, I would argue that a division, if they got it right, was far too strong. And Slim thought this as well. He thought, well, you know, if Sato's coming with a whole division, it means he's going to hold Kohima and smash down on Dimapur and capture that from me. This was Slim's biggest concern. His biggest nightmare was that Dimapur would be threatened. But I very quickly have to tell you, the fourth attack was actually onto the top of Imphal by the 15th Division here, coming across the Chinwin at Homelin and going up a little track, a jeep track to Ukral and coming down by Sangshak onto Kangla Tongbi. Kangla Tongbi was the site of the Lion Box, which was the largest administrative box at in the Imphal plain as well. And of course, it was on the road to Imphal. And if you think about this old linear concept of operations, it's way behind the front line. The Japanese would come this way and we would fight them that way. And Kangla Tongbi was behind. Mutiguchi, smart guy. This move was a very, very smart move. And in planning terms, nothing should have gone wrong with Mutiguchi's plan, but a lot did. I just need to very quickly say that the Indian National Army, which had been formed after malaria in Singapore, by this stage had about 16,000 Indian troops in it, supported Yamamoto's attack, which was actually, I forgot to mention that Yamamoto, each Japanese division had 2 major generals, one who commanded the division, the other who commanded the division's infantry. And Yamamoto was the infantry commander in the 33rd Division. And his job, was to move his troops, was to fight the battle here up into Tamo and the Shenam Saddle. Right, let's just move on and talk very quickly about the Japanese Achilles heel. It's important that you know this before we proceed. There's General Kawabe on the left-hand side. Not the brightest, not the sharpest tool in the box, I'm afraid. Wonderful moustache, but actually he was the man whose strategic vision failed the Japanese, I believe, in 1944. He was the man who denied Mutaguchi the chance of going to Dimapur, and he and Mutaguchi's subordinate, General Sato here, essentially conspired with each other to deny Mutaguchi the opportunity. Because when Mutaguchi gave Sato his orders, he said to Sato, "You only need to send a battalion down to Dimapur to secure it, but it'll avoid a big fight at Kohima. If you can drop down the hills through the Bokatan track, go along to Dimapur, undertake a surprise attack on Dimapur, you'll be amazed at what happens." Well, Sato, sadly, and Yanagida down here and Yamauchi here, 31st, 15th and 33rd Divisions, all hated this man here. They all hated Mutaguchi. They squabbled. They were all part of different political factions in Japan. Their egos drove most things. They didn't cooperate together. And one of the problems that Mutaguchi faced was that he was just frankly too complacent. He wasn't a modern general. He wasn't a general like Slim, who would make sure that he was up with the forward divisional commanders and corps commanders, not interfering unnecessarily, but making sure that the direction of the battle was undertaken in accordance with his plan. For the first part of Operation C, Mutaguchi was sitting with his geishas in Meimyo, a long way away, in the hills, the cool hills of the British summer station above Mandalay. He was a long way from the action. So Japanese command failures were a very, very significant factor in Japanese failure in 1944. Let's now move on very quickly. I mentioned last night actually that when Wavell turned up in October 1944 after the battle, and he was shown around, he said, can't really make head or tail of this. It's all a little bit confusing. It sounds and seems as though the battle was fought in penny packets. And Slim thought about this and described it in his book, Defeat Victory. The best way of describing the Battle of Imphal Kohima, essentially one campaign, two battles, was using the spokes of a wheel. So let's just go around them with Imphal in the middle. We've got Kohima at the top. We've got Ukral and Sangshat. Ukral is a lovely Naga village, and Sangshak, which I was able to visit for the first time a couple of years ago with James Holland on that spoke. Down here, we've got the Shenam and the Moray and the Tamu spoke. Down the bottom, we've got the Bishampur, which is about where my red spot is, and the Tiddim spoke. The only other track out of Imphal, and it was only a track, it was a walking track. Actually, some elephants under Elephant Bill used this to escape from Imphal in 1944, was to Silkar in Assam. And Silkar you can see up there on the map. So it wasn't a track that could be used for large numbers of troops or coming or going. And then Kangnatombi, which I've mentioned. So that's the spokes on the wheel. So let's just very quickly go through each of these to give you a sense of what happened in the battle. And I'll just talk it through very, very quickly. Before we do that, we need just to describe Slim's plan, which is very straightforward. Slim had one corps in Imphal itself. It was the most he could support logistically, bearing in mind that his only line of communication was that jolly road going up through the hills to Kohima and then over to Dimapur. He had the Four Corps, which was based in the center of Imphal, and part of Four Corps there were three divisions, two forward divisions. The wonderful 17th Indian Infantry Division, who we now know very well under Punch Cowan, based down the hills in Tiddim and Mount Kennedy or Kennedy Peak. The wonderful 20th Indian Division under a very fine Indian commander called General Douglas Gracie, which had been raised in Ceylon in 1942 and was very well trained and raring to fight. And then back in Imphal itself was the 23rd Indian Division, commanded unusually not by an Indian officer or a Gurkha officer, but by an officer in the Royal Engineers, Uvri Roberts, who Slim had served with in the 10th Indian Division in the Middle East. And all three divisional commanders were absolutely first class. Back here in Kohima and Dimapur, he had what was known as the line of communication commander under a chap called General Ranking. So no fighting troops, just lots of what some historians have called, probably rightly, odds and sods. The basic plan that Slim had was, in a nutshell, was as soon as the Japanese threat emerged, that the 17th Division would withdraw from Tiddim and come up to Bishanpur, and the 17th Division would defend the southern side of Imphal. The 20th Division would fight at Moray and Tamu until such a point as it was felt necessary to bring it back into the hills, oh, I'm not too far up there, the hills above Palal at Shanab, and Kohima would be defended by a couple of battalions of Sam Rifles and Sam Regiment, and behind all of this, back in India, he had available to him the Army Reserve, which was effectively the 2nd British Division based in Pune. Slim's idea was that when the Japanese came, he would simply contract his forces to a point where they were able to stop, create defensive positions, and fight back the Japanese. His basic argument was that he needed to withdraw into Imphal so that the Japanese would be stretched out over long lines of communication, vulnerable to air and counterattack, and the advantage would lie with him, Slim, and not with Mutiguchi. And it was a very sound plan. Its weakness was that it involved retreating, and retreating at this time of the war was not a particularly popular subject anywhere in Delhi or London. And Slim got a bit of stick for doing this, but he stuck to his guns. What we also need to remember, of course, is that with Hargo, we'll talk about this in a moment, the Sakurai's offensive against the British in Arakan, Slim had the 15th Corps in Arakan heavily involved in the fighting. Actually, by this stage, 15th Corps had been taken off Slim, and it reported directly into General Gifford as the head of the 11th Army Group. And so Slim was focusing hard on this, but in Arakan, we still had a 15th Corps, which was, just to remind you, the 5th Division under General Briggs, the 7th Division under General Messavi, and the 26th Division under General Lomax. So let's quickly go to the next slide, and we'll talk through what happened next. Well, first thing to say is that General Mutiguchi made a number of assumptions in 1941 about how easy it would be to defeat the British in Manipur and Assam. And he thought that all he needed to do was a repeat of what Aida had done in 1942, early 1942, and smash the British where they were. And he calculated that his army would be able to capture Imphal within 3 weeks, 21 days. Remember also that Mutiguchi was the man who said that the British were weaker than the Chinese. So he didn't really have any worry about what they could achieve. And remember, he had paid close attention to Wingate, whose men had carried a lot of their food with them on their journey into Burma in 1943. So he thought it was eminently possible. He also believed that, once he captured British stocks at Moray and Tiddim, then that would fuel the army's advance. As an aside, he was right. If Sato had fallen on Dimapur, he would have discovered a cornucopia of supplies that would have kept the entire 15th Army going for many, many months indeed. And that was another part of the failure of Kuwabe and Sato to really realize the extent of the opportunity, the scale of the opportunity that faced a bold commander. Sato was a pig-headed commander, a very good soldier, but not a strategist, and it's in that he failed. So you'll see in a lot of history books and a lot of the Japanese blame Mutiguchi for not fueling the advance on India, the march on Delhi in the way that Sato demanded. But actually, Sato got to Kohima in time. He with sufficient resources to keep his army alive. And if he had gone down to Dimapur, Mutaguchi's assumptions would have been proven right. Unfortunately, as soon as they were stopped in battle, and Satu at Kohima and Yanagida and Yamalchi and the divisions around Imphal, as soon as they were stopped in battle and started to a grinding attritional campaign against the British, this lack of logistics, this lack of food essentially and ammunition really played havoc on them. They didn't take much heavy weaponry with them. They took tanks through the Tamu area, but it was basically an infantry-based offensive. And the British, of course, as you know from last night, by this stage had Lee Grant tanks in quite considerable numbers, some Lee Grant tanks in Imphal itself and others around Kohima. And those Lee Grant tanks, and of course Arakan, were to play a significant role in the fighting. A quick word also just to remind you that actually by this time the British and Indian and Gurkha and West African soldiers were actually very good. They'd been retrained. They had new equipment. They had trained through the monsoon. They recognized their capabilities and what they were able to achieve. They had air superiority. They had learned how to integrate armor and aircraft, and they had access to air supply. A quick slide here, which I'm not going to go through because we don't really have a lot of time, apart from one thing, which is this point in the middle about dominating vital ground. The major discovery by General Briggs and Messery in early 1944 in Arakan was that instead of going head to head with the Japanese, what they needed to do was to identify the ground that was vital to the Japanese defense and cut it off. The Japanese, as you know, didn't really rely much on lines of communication, but there was always ground that was important to them. And so instead of getting your head around, as many soldiers naturally do, they think, well, there's an army there, there are 10 tanks there, I'm going to need 20 tanks to defeat them. Or there's a battalion there, I'm going to need a brigade to defeat that battalion, and so on. It's a force on force concept. It's an idea that you have to beat the enemy in a bloody battle to be able to achieve victory. No, Briggs and Messery and Christensen, who's the corps commander by this stage, and Slim all said, actually, it's not important necessarily to defeat the Japanese. We're going to have to do that, but in battle. But a better way to defeat the Japanese is to take away ground that's important to them. And as soon as this happened in Arakan, it created dramatic success for the British. And this was exactly the same case in the battle for Manipur and Assam. By dominating ground that was important to the Japanese for reinforcement, for securing food, for movement, it disrupted their plans and forced the Japanese to conform to the British plan. And in this sense, operational planning, British operational planning in Imphal and Kohima succeeded fabulously. Let me just, I said I was only going to mention one thing. I'm going to mention long-range penetration. This particular painting, which Peter Dennis had painted for me a number of years ago, depicts a patrol action by the Duke of Wellington's regiment, who were in a brigade, the 23rd Long-Range Penetration Brigade, a Chindit brigade diverted to support the British defense of the Naga Hills, who are operating north of Kohima in the Naga Hills in order to deny the hills and the villages and everything they had, the rice and so on, to the Japanese. It was phenomenally successful just by being there. The 23rd Long-Range Penetration Brigade marched a long way. They all lost a lot of weight. They fought ferocious actions against small numbers of Japanese. It prevented the Japanese from using the hills to achieve their wider purposes. And that was the advantage of long-range penetration. This is something I mentioned yesterday. What was the operational effect of the brigade? It was very successful in persuading the Japanese, or preventing the Japanese from exercising full control of the battlefield. Now let's just quickly go through the phases in the battle. The first phase was Hargo, which we discussed last night, so we'll move on. The second phase was the advance against the 17th Indian Division at Tiddim. It nearly went belly up at the start because the command, or the order to punch Cowan to withdraw, was actually given too late by the corps commander. But nevertheless, Punch Cowan recognized that he needed to move. And we then had 2 weeks from the middle of March through to the end of March, early April, where the 17th Division fought their way back all the way up to Bishanpur. And it was quite an extraordinary but very, very successful fighting withdrawal. Those soldiers who are listening in tonight will recognize that a withdrawal in contact is the hardest thing, the hardest phase of war. And it certainly was here, but it was managed spectacularly by the 17th Indian Division, 2 brigades, Gurkha brigades, and they were supplied by air. They had close air support or fighter ground attack available every day. They carried their own artillery. The reserves from 23 Indian Division came rushing down the road to help them, and they extracted themselves with some considerable success. Quite a successful story. Phase 2A, the Tidin withdrawal to Bishanpur. The second attack was via Tamu, and interestingly enough, the Japanese began the offensive, Yamamoto's force here, against the 20th Indian Division, Douglas Gracie's division, thinking that they would simply just walk over them. And nothing of the kind happened. The 20th Indian Division stood firm. They caused considerable casualties in Japanese ranks. The Japanese weren't expecting this kind of response. And it's really reflective or provides evidence for a dramatic failure in 1943 of the Japanese to understand the changes that were happening to the British Indian armies in India. They just going into battle in 1944, assuming that or expecting that everything was exactly the same as it had been in 1942, was negligent in the extreme. So the story here was that Douglas Gracie held off very successfully the tanks and the infantry attacks that the Yamamoto forced against him. But that defensive position was undone by the operations of this force, Yamalchi, taking the 15th Division up through the jeep track to Latan, Ukral, and Sangshak through the north. And this was an attack that took Slim and Schoon's corps commander by surprise. And this ultimately forced Schoons to order General Gracie at Tamu to come back, because you'll just see very simply from the map that with the Japanese dropping down onto Imphal from the north, Gracie needed to come back to hold the Shenam saddle, the Shenam heights, to prevent him being outflanked, to prevent the defenses in Imphal being outflanked. Because what could have happened is that the 15th Division could have come down here to the Shenam saddle themselves, which was undefended, and allowed the 20th Division to wither on the vine. So it forced this movement here, secret movement, very, very successful initially, very nearly cut the 20th Division off and had the potential to discombobulate the British. It didn't, but that was the threat. A quick point about the 15th Division attack. One of the problems that Yamalchi had coming up here was that, all these Japanese commanders were hard, aggressive, fighting men, and they wanted to defeat the British whenever they could find them. So they weren't very good at allowing British positions to wither on the vine. And famous battle at Sangshak, defended by the Indian Parachute Brigade, and 2 battalions of which they were half strength, but they fought ferociously against men who were supposed to be going up to Kohima, in fact, and probably took 4 days off the Sato's movement towards Kohima. And the lesson that Aida had taught the British in early 1942 was hold those positions that might disrupt your advance, but go for the strategic objective, or go for Rangoon. And Yamalchi didn't do this. Yamalchi should have just gone straight to Imphal and left Sangshak and all those British positions that he found on the way alone, but he didn't. He stopped and fought, and it caused them lots of casualties. And the upshot of this, very quickly, because we need to move on, is that by the time Yamalchi came out of the hills into the northern side of Imphal, he was on his last gasp. He had very, very little left. His effort had been diminished significantly. The last phase was, of course, Kohima, and the fascinating point about Kohima was that despite this, the whole of the 31st Division falling on Kohima over a period of days beginning on about the 4th of April, distractions had resulted in the division arriving in Kohima in dribs and drabs. The first was Sangshak, which I've mentioned. Troops who should have been going straight for Kohima stopped and fought a battle at Sangshak against the 50th Parachute Brigade here. And they were also distracted at a place called Karason, which is about here, and Jessamy by very, very brave men of the Assam Rifles, Naga soldiers, basically a territorial army regiment, who were the eyes and ears of Kohima far out here in the Naga hills. And they also caused immense damage to the Japanese advancing on Kohima. When the Japanese first arrived at Kohima, Kohima itself was a, I need to say at the outset that there was two parts to the Battle of Kohima. The first was the siege of Kohima, and the second was the battle for it. And I just very quickly, in 2 minutes, explain that the siege of Kohima took place between about the 5th of April, and it ran through to about the 20th of April. And in those 2 weeks, a very small number of diehards, it was a Rorke's Drift battle, possibly less than 1,000 men with rifles, 2,500 men on what was known as Garrison Hill at Kohima. Garrison Hill was a hill on the road that loops around Kohima and goes down to Dimapur. And the other part of Kohima is Naga Hill itself, or Kohima Hill, which sits above it. But at the point at which the battle hit, the Kohima Ridge or Garrison Hill, it's Summerhouse Hill, it's got lots of names, but the ridge where the battle was fought for those first 2 weeks, the defenders of the ridge pushed back, suffered massive casualties, but they still held the ridge, and they held off Sato's division. It was one of the most extraordinary battles of the war. This very small number of men, the British element of it was part of a territorial army battalion, the 4th Battalion of the Royal West Kents, known as the Dirty Harp 100, 400 or so soldiers. When the battle was over, there were less than 100 left. But they had held off the major part of a Japanese division, which made the mistake of trying to engage the British on the ridge in dribs and drabs. So as soon as Sato's forces arrived in Kohima, they went into action. He didn't keep them back, and they didn't engage in a synchronized fashion. And of course, we all know that they didn't do what they should have done, which is to go down to the Bokudin track and fall on Dimapur. So I mentioned the 2nd British Division before. We're running out of time, so I'm just going to quickly say that Slim asked for the 2nd Division to come as a reinforcement. It was moved very quickly in 2 weeks from Pune, south of Bombay, all the way across India. It arrived in Dimapur, detrained. It's complicated business we don't have time to discuss tonight, but it sounds relatively easy. It was a very hard business. And the 2nd British Division then climbed the hills from Dimapur and engaged, first of all, with the 7th Indian Division, which had been flown in from Arakan. Very quick point, the 5th Division under Briggs was flown into Imphal, and the 7th Division was flown to Dimapur under Messavi. And the 7th and the 2nd Divisions then fought the Battle of Kohima, which was to fight to unleash Sato's hold on Kohima in the period beyond the 20th of April through to early June. So if you're not too au fait with the battle, quite a complicated battle, just remember the first phase was the siege, which stopped Sato. Sato then got into a position where he just wanted to defeat the British and the Indians at Kohima, and the 2nd Division and the 7th Division came up and fought him off. Sato, being a very aggressive man, couldn't possibly take defeat, and decided to stay on to the death. And in fact, it was instructed to fight on to the death. So in order to bring everything together, let's just have a quick summary of where we were in April, early April, we know that Yanagida had been stopped in Bishanpur in the south. Sato had reached Kohima but hadn't managed to break through the siege. Yamamoto had forced the Douglas Gracie's division to withdraw to Shenam, but was unable at any stage to break through at Shenam. And Yamalchi had really tried very hard to get in through the north, but had failed to do so because he'd been distracted on the way. Slim's response in the period between April and June, I've mentioned the 2nd Division coming through, tasked with relieving Kohima and defeating Sato. 7th Division, likewise. 5th Division, I've mentioned. The administrative sustenance of Imphal was called Operation Stamina, and food and fuel and ammunition and reserve troops were flown in massive numbers into Imphal, and what were known as useless miles were flown out. And I've mentioned the 23rd Long Range Penetration Brigade began operating in those hills in north of Kohima in order to be able to deny the territory to the Japanese. And this map, which was in my book on Slim, really I like a lot, because what it does is it demonstrates the extent of the reinforcements available to Slim and his use of air power. Air power and aerial superiority and air transport were some of the defining characteristics of their campaign. With the road line of communication cut at Kohima, the only way to get reinforcements into Imphal itself was by air, and the availability, the ready availability of 25 squadrons of Douglas Dakota C-47 Skytrains, in other words, was incredibly important. And there's a photograph here of kickers out. These guys were strapped into the aircraft and responsible for kicking out stuff. And the photograph at the top I love. This is now this is the Imphal main airfield. The airfield, if you fly to Imphal now, is Tully Hal. This is the north, and the mountain ahead of it is Nunchi Gum, which is that's Nunchi Gum here, which is an extraordinary story. It's the closest point the Japanese got to Imphal during the battle. Okay, so we don't have time to talk about the collapse of Japanese command, but suffice to say, this is exactly what happened. Eventually, Sato decided on his own volition to withdraw in early June from Kohima. Shedding heavy tears, he said, he withdrew. He smashed his radios because he had fallen out so magnificently with Mutaguchi, whose staff, he said, were worse than cadets. And he then began marching back across the mountains towards the Chindwin. And the Japanese defeat precipitated what the Japanese then called, and now called, the Road of Bones, which Fogelkeen has written about brilliantly several years ago as the title of his book. And the British operations, really from about the 21st or 22nd of June through to the end of August, were essentially revolved around fighting the Japanese and pursuing them all the way back to the Chindwin. A couple of things as we end, and we can talk about this in perspective. It was a very bold offensive by the Japanese, but not bold enough, and this is the real problem. There was a very poor logistical plan, and the very poor strategy that I've described was Kuwabi's fault, not Mutaguchi's. Always get your strategy right. As Monty used to say, just have a plan. Work out what your plan is. And plans are all based around achieving a strategy. The Allies, of course, under this gentleman on the left, who you now know is the greatest British general of the Second World War, was to have a very smart defensive plan, even if it meant a withdrawal. To have a very excellent logistical plan, to deploy innovation, such as the Long Range Penetration Brigade, to be able to redeploy your forces using air power or aerial resupply, air transport where you have it, and to utilize the new fighting spirit you have in your army. Don't ever forget, though, that the entirety of this campaign was fought in the middle of the monsoon. And there we are. There's a picture there of troops, Indian troops in Bishanpur. I haven't been to Bishanpur in the monsoon. I've been there several times in the dry season, and it was wet enough. Fighting through the monsoon around Loktak Lake was an extraordinary feat in itself. a couple of things as we finish. It's important to remember how important Kohima was in the big scheme of things. In 1944, this is the first time a formed up Japanese army had been defeated substantially. I mean, this was a massive defeat. In my several visits to Japan in the early 2000s, when I was researching this to start with, I was quite struck at how the Japanese regard their defeat. They call their defeat in the Second World War, sorry, the word they used to describe their defeat in the Second World War as Imphal. Imphal was totemic for the Japanese. They lost many more in the Battle for Okinawa. They lost about 85% of their fighting troops involved in Operation C in 1944. It was a very, very significant defeat. And you know what? One of the most extraordinary features about their defeat was they were defeated by the 14th Army, which was largely Indian. The Indian Army in 1945, sorry, the 14th Army in 1945, 606,000 men, 87% was Indian, slightly less than that in 1944. But there was a rapidly declining number of British troops available to fight anywhere in the world. We're running out of men. This was an Indian battle. Some points of special interest. I always put this photograph up because I think Brigadier Lancelot Perrone, who commanded the 23rd Brigade, had a better moustache than Kawabe, but we don't have time. You'll also, as I end, know, I hope, that the 2nd Division Memorial, which is absolutely fabulous, and if you can ever get there, go and visit Kohima, is the place where the Kohima epitaph is engraved on the memorial to the 2nd Division. When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today. Right, I've finished, and I'll hand back to Bertie.
Thank you, Rob. Brilliant. We've got a few questions that have come in, so let's try and get some of those. Anthony, you've got 2 hands up, so I assume you want to put a question directly to Rob. So I'm going to unmute you and give you the floor, Anthony Pope.
Go for it, Anthony.
Anthony, we'll come back to you in a second if your mic comes on. In the meantime, I've got a couple from a few others. Lucy's father was injured badly at Kohima. She's asking, how long did the Battle of the Tennis Court last for? He was injured there and sent to the military hospital in Calcutta. So how would he have been transported out?
Great. The battle for the tennis court is effectively 2 weeks. And the tennis court itself was the last part of Garrison Hill, Summerhouse Hill, that was captured by the British. And around the, do you know, that's completely wrong. I've mixed that up, actually. The initial part of the Battle of the Tennis Court was 2 weeks, but actually it went on till about the 16th of May. So we're actually talking about 6 weeks in total. And it was finally taken with the use of tanks. Can you believe it or not? Tanks were winched up Summerhouse Hill. I mean, I look at it today and I think, how on earth did they do that? But it was quite extraordinary. So he would have been taken back. He would have been evacuated. And this is a really significant question. Thank you, Lucy, for asking it. Because medical evacuation procedures in 1944 were second to none. 14th Army medical treatment processes were fabulous. And of course, the Japanese had nothing like it. So he would have almost certainly been taken off the from Kohima down the road to Dimapur by someone probably in the American Field Ambulance. These were people who had volunteered to go to war but not carry weapons. Many of them were pacifists and Quakers and so on. And I interviewed one guy, Mike Ball, many years ago in New York, and he was an incredible character. He spent most of his time just holding the hands of British and Indian and Gurkha wounded from Kohima all the way down to Dimapur and then back up again, several trips a day. He would have gone to a field hospital in Dimapur and be patched up, and then almost certainly he would have been flown back to a rare hospital around Calcutta. He may well have gone by train, but there were very few, there's very little evacuation by trains at the time. He might have actually gone by train to Guwahati, which is on the other side of the Brahmaputra. And the reason I sort of umming and ahhing about the trains is actually because the trains had to cross the Brahmaputra. There was no railway bridge across the Brahmaputra, and a train going to the Brahmaputra had to then be detrained, put onto barges, carried across the Brahmaputra, and put onto another a line with a different gauge. So by March and April 1944, the wounded were being flown out. It was just far easier.
Thanks, Rob, and thank you, Lucy, for the question. Anthony, if you are there.
Yep, can you hear me?
Hi,
Yes.
Anthony. Yeah, I can hear you. Rob, please go ahead, Anthony.
Just a quick question. My father fought in the Devonshire
Yes.
Regiment,
Yeah.
and I wondered, you talk about battalions a lot, so you never hear anything about the breakdowns of what
Yes.
regiments were involved. And I just wondered where the Devons fought their part in that campaign.
There are some very good books that describe the Devons. The Devons fought up on the Shenham Saddle, and they had a hard deal of it. And yes, I've been rushing through this tonight. It's very hard to encapsulate a 4-month battle in 45 minutes, and I failed. But the Devons fought very, very bravely along the Shenham Saddle, and if I can say this, had a very good war, had a very good battle. There are some good books on the entire campaign of which the Devons fought, which are worth mentioning. And I think Straight On for Tokyo was written by the commanding officer of the Devons. I might have got that wrong. Straight On for Tokyo by Colonel O.G. White. But if you want just to go and buy a book off the internet that describes the battle, you can't go far wrong from John Latimer's book, which I'll just get now. John Latimer was a very good friend of mine. He died, unfortunately, of an aneurysm some years ago. But the Burma, the Forgotten War, there we are, is a very, very good book. And he tells the story of the war from the soldier's perspective. He goes through it, unlike me tonight, giving you the strategy and the big picture. He goes through it bit by bit, and he used the Burma Campaign Memorial Library at SOAS as his source material, and it's a really, really first-class book. And I should have mentioned this the other day, but here's an opportunity to say, if you're going to buy one book on the Burma Campaign, it's not mine, then buy this.
That's great, fantastic. The other sort of aspect I sort of have in the back of my mind is mules and
Yes.
the part that they played.
Yes, very
significant.
Yes, very significant. Two sorts of mule-stroke horses. There were the standard mules, but the problem with mules is they were quite difficult and needed lots of fodder and all the rest of it. And the other sort of, and they weren't strong enough for some of the mountain work. So the British Army purchasing teams went to Argentina and bought in ponies. And so in the Burma Campaign, you see both mules and ponies, and they really were quite ubiquitous from 1943 onwards. They were first of all given to the troops training for special force, so the Chindits, but then found their way into most other operations as well. Most battalions had mules.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anthony. In Ferguson's Wild Green Earth, Rob, he writes very well about the relationship between the mules and the men, and quite amusing. And apparently there was no love lost between the bullocks and the men, and it was a very different relationship.
Everyone celebrated when a bullock went down and was eaten, but I think the relationship with the mules is very similar to the relationship dog owners have with their pets.
Yeah, well, I think that was it. He said that the bullocks knew who their minders were, whereas the bullocks were indifferent to whoever was looking after them or not.
Yeah. The bullocks weren't trained to walk. They weren't designed to walk. They were designed to eat.
We've got a couple from Malcolm, Rob. He asked, why did the Japanese bother with Imphal when Kohima was the key to the road to Dimapur? And secondly,
Well,
if the Japanese had won at Kohima and Imphal, what would their next move have been?
Okay, great questions. They had to deal with Imphal. Imphal was a very, very significant locale of British assets, and there are three very strong divisions there. And the only way that they would be able to deny that threat to their position in Burma would be to defeat the British in Imphal. But as I've suggested at quite some length today, a better way of defeating the British in Imphal would have been to capture Dimapur and starve them out. And that was the logical thing. Mutaguchi was completely convinced of it. Slim was completely convinced of it. I've spent 20 years looking at this, and I'm also convinced they had it right. Dimapur was the answer. Now, if the Japanese had been successful in Imphal and Kohima, captured Dimapur, I don't think. Well, the first thing is that the British would have had no possible response. What they would have had to have done is bring up their forces on the west bank of the Brahmaputra, Guwahati perhaps, and think about launching an attack against Dimapur and Toledo. I think they would have just stopped it. I think they would have withdrawn all their troops from Eastern India. They would have let the Japanese have it, and they would have then focused on an amphibious operation against Rangoon, Malaya, and Singapore. I think it would have been cataclysmic, but also completely, yes, cataclysmic is the word. It would have prevented the British and the Americans from doing anything further in Burma. And Mutaguchi was that far from achieving it.
And am I right in saying that, or believing that Mutaguchi, he personally wanted to continue on to India, although that was clearly not what was being granted from above?
This is exaggerated. He wanted to go to Dimapur. He wasn't interested in going into India per se. He did listen to Subhash Chandra Bose, and he used that as an argument for going further in. But his argument was the domino argument. He said, if I go to Dimapur, I've destroyed the 14th Army, and I've also destroyed Stilwell up and Lido. And it may well lead to a domino effect where Bengal, of course, was the most nationalistic province in India, it might rise up. He didn't really care whether it did or not. You know, that was politics for him. But he was right in focusing on the opportunities that Dimapur offered him, and was denied by Sato's and Kwabe's ignorance.
Lovely. Rob, we've got time for just one more question, and Malcolm's got his hand up, so I'm going to try and unmute you, Malcolm. If you go ahead now and try and speak. Malcolm, are you there?
I'm unmuted now, am I?
Yep.
We can hear you,
Yeah,
Malcolm.
Right. Given the scenario that you've just outlined, politically, that would hardly have been acceptable, would it?
What to the Japanese?
1944, with Bengal on starvation rations, and the British sitting on the top of a, not quite a volcano, but certainly rumbling a bit. They would have had to have tried to unseat the Japanese, would they not?
Yes, you would imagine so, and I'd want to say yes, but actually how? You know, we're talking about 750 miles from Dimapur back to Calcutta. You know, it's not close. Sorry, it's 400 miles to Calcutta. You know, the length of the line of communication was such that actually I struggled to understand how a British and American army in 1944 might have been able to take Imphal back, and it would have been a very, very difficult job. In fact, what you also need to know, I don't think I've mentioned, is that throughout the war, there was a long running argument about the best way of getting rid of the Japanese in Burma. One approach was to enter Burma through Upper Burma, you know, above the Irrawaddy, go across to Mandalay, and then attack from the north in conjunction with the Chinese, and still coming down from to Michinar and so on. Churchill described that as akin to jumping in the sea to wrestle with a shark. Why on earth would you want to do that when actually you've got a better option, which is to get into some ships and launch an amphibious attack against Rangoon and an amphibious attack against Malaya and Singapore? So I'm pretty confident that actually had Eastern Bengal and Northern Assam being taken by the Japanese, there would have been no practical answer to recovering it. And they would have simply diverted their assets to an amphibious operation in 1945. And remember also, you know, if the Japanese had taken the Brahmaputra Valley, you know, they were very, very extended. I mean, Mutaguchi only had 100,000 men. Getting any further beyond the Brahmaputra, you know, I don't think it would have been possible. but the political noise would have been amazing. And you're right. I mean, I think it may well have caused the end of the Raj. The war did bring about the end of the Raj, of course it did, but it would have been much more difficult to sustain any form of sensible government in 1944 and 45 had the British failed to protect Eastern India.
Lovely. Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you, Rob. I think we'll leave it there. Another fantastic session. Thank you all for your questions. Those who we didn't get to this time, who had questions for other aspects of the campaign, Rob will do his best to get to those either in later sessions or outside of the sessions. But thank you for your questions and your emails. And we will be back tomorrow for the Chindits at 7 p.m. So much to look forward to still. Have a good evening, everyone. Keep your questions coming in and your comments. We love reading them, and we'll be back tomorrow evening and see you then.
Keep
Good
those
night.
hats.
All the best.
See you later.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.